go ahead. The clock on the wall says we can start this March 17th, Happy St. Patrick's Day meeting of the Board of Harbor Commissioners. Mary, if you would take roll.
Frank Kelly.
Here.
Betsy Kramer. Here. Luann Kushin. Here. Corey Bantalan. Present. Eric Friedman. Here. Jim Sloan. Here. Bill Spicer. Here.
All right. Mr. Bridley, are there any changes to the agenda?
Mr. Chair, no changes this evening.
Okay. At this time, we would take public comment from any item which is not on the agenda. Okay. So then we go to the approval of the minutes of the February 17th meeting. Is there a motion to approve those minutes? Move. Is there a second? Second. Okay. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Minutes are approved. The department update, the director's report.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, good evening. Just a couple items that have gone on to City Council. A seasonal adjustment amendment to the lease for Shellfish, which allows them to pay rent during the busy season and less so in the winter months. The other item which we had to kind of do as an emergency repair involved our fish house or ice house, where we make ice for the commercial fishing, and we had some significant repairs that needed to be done due to the Freon, which began leaking from that system, and we were in a position where we had to do that as an emergency purchase order and then put some funding in place for the ongoing maintenance throughout the year, and that was approved by council. Next item, which I'm going to report on briefly, involves our Marina One reconstruction project, which, as you know, is kind of the report of the month. The good news is we are making significant progress towards the completion of that project, or at least the first half of that project for this year. PDOC is going to be energized, if not tomorrow, Monday, which means the electrical will be turned back on and boats will be allowed to return to the slips. We anticipate that they will be back by next weekend, and at the same time, notices will be given probably starting tomorrow for the boat owners on ODOC to begin moving out to their temporary spaces starting probably Sunday of next week, once all the boats from P have returned. One of the real successes of this has been our ability to relocate the boats within the harbor. We've not had to send someone off to Ventura or Channel Islands during this construction period. So we've found visitor slips, our own, and some transient slips, or what we call TC, temporary cruising slips, that were made available to us and kept everybody in the harbor. And we expect the same to be true with ODOC. One of the components of the completion of P Finger was the fact we were able to add 4 additional newly created slips as part of the construction, 2 50-foot slips and 2 30-foot slips. The protocol for assigning these slips is to go to the next individuals who are on the wait list and assign those to the next person. So starting April 1st, we will send out those letters to those individuals with the expectation that they will be able to fulfill the requirements under the permit and obtain a vessel and place it in that slip within 90 days. Same process we followed back in 98, 99 when we built 75 new slips with the expansion of Marina One and some new slips that were added in Marina 4. So I think that's it for the director's report. Tentative agenda for next month, April. At least the one item I think we have pending is the Clean Marina report. So I would answer any questions you might have.
All right. Betsy.
Mr. Bradley, were there any effects from the tsunami on the new marina work?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Kramer, if you don't mind, I'd like to cover that as part of our communications at the end of the meeting.
All right. Any other comments or questions for Mr. Bradley? Thank you, John. And Scott, we'll go to the business services report.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. The lease agreement with Don Hedden, doing business as Captain Don's Cruises, expired on September 30th, 2006. The business offered whale watching aboard the 149-passenger vessel Rachel G. until 2006 and continues to operate harbor and coastal tours aboard its 49-passenger vessel Harbor Queen. Another business provided parasailing rides from Stearns Wharf from 1998 to 2004. The department's goal is to restore additional boating and recreational opportunities to Stearns Wharf, such as were previously offered, including but not limited to sunset cruises, whale watching, parasailing, and so forth. The department is seeking a potential new operator for the Stearns Wharf concession, and staff began advertising this availability in September of 2010. The department received 27 inquiries from its advertising efforts, and a total of a request for qualifications was released in November of 2010, and a total of 6 responses to the RFQ were received by the January 6, 2011 deadline. The selection committee, consisting of Commissioners Bantalan, Sloan, and Spicer, selected 2 finalists to submit formal business proposals. The 2 proposals were received from Santa Barbara Water Taxi and Action Water Sports of Tahoe, but unfortunately the proposals fell short of expectations. Santa Barbara Water Taxi discovered that the 72-foot vessel identified in its initial proposal to provide dinner cruises and private charters would not meet California Air Resources Board emissions standards and would need to be repowered at an expense that made it unreasonable for this endeavor. Santa Barbara Water Taxi submitted a second proposal prior to the deadline, using a 36-foot vessel of the same make and model as Captain Don's current vessel, Harbor Queen. Action Water Sports also found it had difficulties with its initial choice of vessels for the wharf, which proved not to be up to the company's standards. Action Water Sports located another vessel in excellent shape, but it requires U.S. Coast Guard certification. And late in the process, Action Water Sports received information that the Coast Guard inspection approval certification process could take a protracted period, 6 to maybe even 12 months. So due to the difficulties in locating a suitable vessel that is both Air Resources Board compliant and Coast Guard certified, the selection committee requested that staff reissue the RFP to give the 2 finalists additional time to evaluate alternative vessels or perhaps refine their proposals further, as well as reopen the process to other interested parties. The RFP is worded such that the department is not obligated to accept any proposal or to negotiate with any proposer, and the selection committee does retain the right to reject any or all proposals without cause or liability. And so that's what was determined to be the best course of action given the circumstances, and that concludes the report. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, I do have a request to speak from Fred and Kathy Hirschman on this issue, and they are the owners and operators of the Santa Barbara Water Taxi.
Mr. Kelly, Commissioners, Waterford staff, my wife Kathy and I are owners of Santa Barbara Water Taxi. We are also known as Little Toot. We are grateful for the opportunity to address you this evening. In case you're not aware, we are very interested in the Stearns Wharf Coastal Concession. We feel combining the successful water taxi business and the Stearns Wharf Coastal Concession would generate the maximum amount of business for these licenses. We appreciate the effort that the waterfront staff and selection committee have given to reviewing the candidates for this lease, and although the process was lengthy, it was straightforward and transparent. We are disappointed that there was no interview with the committee as mentioned in the documentation. The interview process would have given us the opportunity to provide clarity to the committee, especially on the engine tier issue and the variety of solutions available. I've spent many hours researching and speaking with staff from the Air Resources Board, also known as CARB, and other sources to truly understand the engine requirements, the deadline dates, and the grants available to bring the engine into compliance. This has been one of the top requirements for choosing the correct vessel, so operating hours were not limited because of the engines that were not compliant. We understand the need to restart the process and encourage you to accelerate the repeat of the RFQ and RFP process so the new lessee can start no later than July 1st. Missing the summer season is key to the success of the first season financially for both the city and the lessee. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know that Fred had also included a letter in our packet, and just so that we're clear on this, I wanted to know, would the committee like to address the issue? Commissioner Sloan? Bantalon?
Yeah, I think on the point of starting this summer, we certainly recognize that missing the summer was a bad deal for everybody involved, and that was one of the things that we had a real hard time getting over. But I think in the proposals that we had, you know, there were a couple of things in there that weren't kind of what we were looking for. The vessels changed in both proposals, and you know, we had heard a few other things from other previous submittees about the cost of the slip and things like that, and it just gave us pause to think about, you know, maybe if we did it again, we could do it a little bit better and get some better proposals. And I would certainly encourage you to continue to submit proposals and see what we can do to find the right concessionaire.
Okay. Any other comments by any of the other committee members? Commissioner Friedman.
To the committee members, would it be possible to reissue the RFP, RFQ, and do that whole process in time for July 1st, like Mr. Hirschman indicated?
I don't think you're on, Commissioner Sloan.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe, Scott, you could give a timeline of what the RFP process is?
Certainly, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Sloan and Friedman. We can certainly get the RFQ, RFP process wrapped up by a July 1st deadline. I don't know that we'd be able to complete a lease negotiation and approval process by that time. The RFQ, RFP is one half of the equation. Negotiating a lease, as you know, could take anywhere from an afternoon to a month or more, and then we've got to get it before the commission and to the council and through that process. So it's to do all of that by July 1st. I don't think it could be done in that time frame.
Okay. Commissioner Sloan.
What is the time frame that we had for the RFP and RFQ in this last go-round?
Well, Commissioner Sloan, the RFQ was the first phase, and it was open from November 16th to January 6th. And then the RFP, the second phase, was open from, I'd say, early February to March 1st was when both were done. We left it open longer than normal during the holiday season, recognizing that there was a lot of downtime because we were right in the middle of Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's holidays, and figured people would be vacationing and doing other things.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? I'm going to basically, and I think I speak for the commission on this, and that is we appreciate the Hirschman's intention, and I read their letter carefully, but I would be, I think it would be remiss to override the committee on their recommendation. There's a very compelling argument, but it would completely undermine the committee process. And so I believe if it's the winning proposal, and then it will be the winning proposal the second time around, and hopefully you will reapply, because I can only congratulate you on what you have done with the water taxi. And are there any other comments or questions on this issue? Commissioner Spicer.
Only that I would echo. We value what the water taxi and the business you've brought to the harbor and how well it's run.
Okay.
And I would say the same thing. I've enjoyed the times I've been on the water taxi, and I think you provide a tremendous service. And so good luck in the resubmission.
All right, and thank you again for coming in this evening and presenting your case. If there are no other comments, we'll go off to the Harbor Operations Report.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. We have 3 cruise ship visits right around the corner this spring, 2 in April and 1 in May on Mother's Day, May 8th. But the first one will be a ship we haven't seen here in Santa Barbara before. The Crystal Symphony will come twice, actually, on Monday, April 11th, and Saturday, April 23rd. Run by Crystal Cruises, the Crystal Symphony is significantly smaller than the Princess ships we've seen in Santa Barbara, more on the order of 600 feet, and it also will carry a lot fewer passengers. We would hope to see maybe 800 passengers come ashore. This is a different clientele, different company, and we've been working closely with them on logistics and planning, and we expect a very successful visit. And then again, the very familiar Sapphire Princess will be back on Mother's Day, Sunday, May 8th. And the Crystal Harmony, which is a sister ship to the Crystal Symphony, it and the Sapphire Princess will visit a total of 4 more times this fall. So altogether, we can look forward to 7. This is the beginning. I think we alerted you a couple of months ago to the 7 cruise ship visits we'd have this year, and they are beginning right around the corner on Monday, April 11th. And speaking of springtime, with the sailing club's opening day ceremonies on Saturday, March 5th, followed by the yacht club ceremonies on Sunday, March 6th, followed by Wet Wednesday starting yesterday. It's hard to miss the fact that boating season has arrived here in Santa Barbara. And as a reminder, Wet Wednesdays, which are a very popular event, are open to all boats whose members are whose owners are members of the U.S. Sailing Association affiliated clubs in Santa Barbara. That means the Yacht Club and the Santa Barbara Sailing Club. And those rate, of course, if you want to crew on one of these boats and you know anybody on any of the boats down there, you're welcome to do that without such affiliation. The races start at 5:10 p.m. on Wednesday afternoons, and they go in like 10-minute intervals after that. I believe there are 6 classes altogether. The races vary in length from 2 to 8 miles, depending on sea conditions and entrance and what have you. And then, of course, it's followed by the ever-famous Yacht Club after party, which is a good time as well. So I would encourage folks to come down and watch the boats. Watching them from the breakwater is a gorgeous sight on Wednesday afternoons. I always look forward to it, if not participating in the races themselves. Wet Wednesday will continue through late October. Last month, Commissioner Chair Kelly, at your request, we have looked into our phone systems at Harbor Patrol. Your request was to look at various options for responding to calls that come in, call it after hours, once administrative staff has gone home at 5 p.m. and before administrative staff arrives at 8 a.m., and especially, of course, when patrol may not be in the office, when they wouldn't be answering the phones if they're out on patrol and what have you. We looked at several aspects of this. One of the things you asked us to look at was the facility or the ability for us to patch calls through from our office phones to officers' cell phones. You also asked us to look at the outgoing message and related issues to see if we couldn't improve the system. And I'm happy to report we have improved the system, although I can't give you good news on the cell phones. We looked into that, and the patching is not only very technically difficult to do, it was the consensus of the patrol officers and the patrol supervisors that because those are secure communications used in law enforcement, fire, and medical response with other first responder agencies, it's important to keep those lines clear. But also there are other sort of technical aspects to it. For example, if you called an officer, if you called the wrong phone, we have 10 officers, who work shift work. If you called the wrong phone, somebody was off for the day. They work 4 10s. In other words, they work 4 10-hour shifts, and they're off 3 days. And they could be tagging a vacation on the top of that if they have vacation time coming. That message could be left and not get answered for quite a long time. But although we were unable to help there, we did find some areas where we were able to help. We looked at the outgoing message, and we've revamped the outgoing message. We noticed one glaring void, and that was letting the public know that they can call on Marine VHF radio on channels 12 or 16 to reach Harbor Patrol when Harbor Patrol is out of the office. But also we looked at all the different phones that could and might and do ring when the officers are out in the field, and we realized that it was a little bit haphazard, and it was very possible that not all the all the messages were being answered in a timely fashion. They may not be answered till the next day when administrative staff got to their phone. And so what we did is we worked with the city's communications and electronics maintenance staff to have calls coming into Harbor Patrol all routed so they roll over to 564-5520, which is the terminal right next to the computer terminal where officers come in from the field and have the running watch log, as you see in our 24-hour watch log, and continue their log. So if they see a blinking light, they're under direct direction specifically now to look at that, respond to those incoming calls as quickly as possible, and move on with their business. So hopefully there won't be any delays, and hopefully none will get lost through the cracks like have happened in the past. So with that, I conclude my report, and I thank you for bringing that phone issue to our attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Mick. Any comments or questions? Okay, Commissioner, boy, I'm really losing it tonight.
Bantalon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mick. That was a great report. Had two questions for you. On the cruise ship visits, do we get any feedback from the Chamber or Downtown Business Association on, how much of an impact the cruise ship visits make on their business?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Bantalon, yes is the answer to that. Though it's not a precise science, we work with the downtown organization and the Chamber of Commerce and the Downtown Visitors Bureau to coordinate the hospitality side of the cruise ship visit, and it's through them we gauge to the best of our ability how much it seems people are stimulating our local economy on any given visit. There are numbers that have been floated out there, something in the neighborhood of $200 a couple, something like that. But like I say, it's not an exact science, but I think it's a distinct economic benefit to the community, and that's what we've been hearing from the hospitality folks.
Thanks. And then that kind of rolls into my second question. Do we have any input on the dates? I think to Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. How much input do we have? Do they just tell us, hey, we're showing up this date, or is there some negotiation there?
That's a great question. Typically, they propose a date because it fits into an itinerary they have, and that itinerary can be a local itinerary, it can be like a regional itinerary, a Catalina, Newport, Santa Barbara, San Francisco kind of thing, or it can be an even broader itinerary, as in the transition visits we get in spring and fall when they're headed to Alaska in the springtime and Mexico in the fall. So I guess the broad answer was not usually. We don't have a lot of say-so in those itineraries, but sometimes we do have some discussions about what might work best relative to a general time frame versus another time frame. But when it comes down to specific dates, we probably wouldn't have picked Monday, April 11th, but that worked in their schedule, and we're happy to take the benefit from it.
Okay, are there any other comments or questions on this point? Okay. Thank you very much, Mick. And now we go off to the new business, Mary.
General lottery drawing, East Beach mooring area. Recommendation that Harbor Commission, via the chair, conduct a general lottery drawing to select and rank prospective mooring permittees in the East Beach mooring area.
Mr. Chair, the East Beach mooring area was established in 2006, and it included 46 mooring sites, which has been reduced by one owing to the discovery of an old boat wreck near one of the sites that was short-scoping one of the people who was moored on it. And that's the rules and regulations regarding that mooring area are governed primarily by City Council resolution, though there is some ordinance language relative to the site as well. But the resolution itself, which was passed in 2006, requires that any time the number of permitted mooring permittees in the area drops to 30 or below, that we conduct what we call a general lottery, which is why we're here tonight. We've had lotteries in 2006, 7, 2009, and 2010. 2006, 2007, and 2010 to assign vessels to vacant moorings. And right now, since the 2010 lottery, owing to, some people decide it's just not for them. Some people end up failing to pay or just decide to get out of the game. We're at 29, below the 30 threshold, and so we're convened here for another one of the general lottery drawings tonight. And for this one, we advertised far and wide, but I think in an economically sound fashion. We advertised in local newspapers and in the Log, a regional boating newspaper. Actually, they wrote an article for us. And so as a result, we ended up with, it started as 46, you see in your staff report. One person dropped out. We received 45 lottery applications during the window period, which closed on March 3rd. And so after the drawing, what will happen is once Commissioner Chair Kelly draws the names and we rank them, we will send out notices to everybody letting them know where their rankings were within the next 14 days. They need to reply to us or they'll lose their opportunity to participate in the program, or this go-round in the program as part of this lottery. And then once we receive those back, we'll have sort of a re-ranking, if you will, because people will drop out or what have you. Figure it's, I ranked 43rd. I'm not going to bother, participating. And so after that, I meet individually, or for people who are way out of town, I have to do it by fax and phone and email and what have you to get their permit applications in. And then once those are in, they have 90 days to provide a mooring and a vessel registered to the mooring on that site. And one thing I'd like to do, Mr. Chair, before we start the drawing is I've got one slide I wanted to show you that will help explain some things. This is a snapshot of the mooring area with the vacant spots as we see it today. And this is by way of explaining that even though a person may be ranked number, let's see, 6, let's say, if the 5, this is purely hypothetical, if the 5 people before him or her all had bigger boats, you can see how this is basically arranged. You see smaller mooring circles toward the beach and shallower water, and deeper ones as you go seaward. If all of those first 5 happened to want, had bigger boats and they took those outside spots, you could be ranked 6th or 7th or 8th and still not get a mooring site assigned to you as part of this process. So I wouldn't want to mislead anybody and think we've got 16 spaces to assign. If I come in anywhere 0 to 16, I'm for sure going to be assigned a spot, because we have to place the appropriate sized boats with wiggle room. It's not like slips with a definite 2-foot overhang. We do have some wiggle room here, and our intention is to accommodate folks the very, very best we can as part of this process. And the converse of that, of course, is you could be ranked 23rd, and it could work to your favor if you're a small boat applicant and the rest were all big boat applicants in front of you, or a majority of them were big, you might be ranked 23rd and get the phone call from us and tell us we have a spot for you. So I just wanted to make that clear to the public that the ranking it is important. It'd be better to be ranked high than low in general, but at the same time, that's the process we go through to assign those permits. And so unless there are any comments from the Commission, I think we're prepared to go ahead and conduct the drawing, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mick, and thanks for that clarification, because hopefully folks will stay with us. This is my 4th drawing, so. Whew. Oh, question. Okay, excuse me, Commissioner Bantolin.
Did have one question. I noticed on the alphabetical list there were 3 instances of, I guess, 2 people and the same last name there. Do we require that each applicant have a vessel so that they can't cherry pick, so to speak?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Bandalon, if I understand your question correctly, they don't have to have a vessel when they apply, okay? Though they do on their application have to put down what size vessel they anticipate putting on the mooring site. So it could be speculative to a degree, like I've always wanted a mooring. I'm ready to go purchase a Catalina 27, but I'm going to wait to see how I'm ranked before I take the plunge. It ranges from that to folks who have vessels moored, berthed in other harbors, and are wishing to get up here to Santa Barbara and get on a mooring. They don't have to have a vessel registered to them right now. They have that 90-day period to get a vessel on the mooring, have the mooring established by one of our city approved mooring inspectors, and get approved and get it permitted.
I guess I'm just concerned that that there could be several folks, in essence, applying for the same spot. Whoever gets, the higher lottery ranking, I guess the other person could just vacate it if they got too high lottery rankings. So I guess we don't have anything in place to stop that. Yeah, exactly.
You're absolutely correct, and we've wrestled with this over the years, and we welcome any fix because we haven't really figured out a way to, regulate around that or design the program to prevent that.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
All right. While that's been going on, so what's going to happen is I'll draw the tickets. I'll read off, let's say, the last 3 numbers, because I think everything in front of that is duplicate. And then Commissioners Kramer and Bantolin will write these down, and we'll have our list with a double check. So we'll go. Number 1, it is 302. The second ticket is 296. And we have a party outside. You bet. Number 3 is 3.
Maybe we should read off the name.
Should we read off the name? Or
Why don't we go through it and then we can read off the names at the end?
how,
Yeah.
yeah,
Wait, but we
can
should
read off the
announce
name
the
if you
names.
if you want. We can read off the name, because otherwise it'll be this droning list of names when we get to the end. So we can back up and say where we are, 1 and 2, which whoever wants to, Commissioner Kramer or Commissioner Bantolin.
Number 1 was George Hernandez. Number 2 was Sarah Hunt.
And then ticket number 3 is 314.
Which is Robert Ralston.
The next is ticket 289.
Robert Robinson.
The next, okay. Next ticket is 319.
Deborah Tucker.
Next ticket is 316.
Joel Venoradel.
Next is 311. Oops.
Stephen Bigelin. Hope I'm not butchering these names too badly.
Next is 294.
Russ Howard.
$313.
Martha Wirtz.
$285.
Jeff Stansfield.
$300.
John Koof. Oops. Sorry, what was that?
300.
Correction, Paul Menga.
Okay.
Thank you.
And then number 12 is 324.
Nicholas Gutheim.
308. Whoops, okay.
Nelson Willis.
Bingo. No, okay. 304. Sorry, Betsy.
Guy Logan.
Mm-hmm. $307.
Hank Waltus.
291.
Richard Stewart.
$312.
Neil Worley.
$321.
Kathleen Hanley.
298. Okay.
William Powell.
298.
William Powell.
305.
Joel Mulder.
290.
David Hunt.
320.
Charles Bagby.
320.
320. Okay, next one is, I'm waiting for you there. Okay, 297.
John Robichaux.
293.
Ken McLaughlin.
301.
There's John Koof. Sorry, John.
Two 292.
Tony Lynn.
317.
Stuart Miller.
310.
Dan Simonson.
295.
Martin Santos.
309.
Alexander Kirichenko.
282.
David Brown.
318.
George Orient.
284.
Juan Hernandez.
306.
Austin Artis.
322.
Thomas Rigney.
286.
Peggy Bear.
281.
Chris Blau.
281. Three 315.
Craig Tillman.
288.
Robert Gregory.
280.
Pamela Orient.
303.
Dieter Hahn.
287.
David Cope.
299.
Donald Olson.
32.
What was the number on that one I lost?
299.
Yeah, but what was that? Is that number 45? Yeah, 45.
What do you have?
Yeah.
Corey?
I have it as 43 as well.
Don't worry. That's why there are three different people doing this. So 299 was 43. Okay. And 323 is number 44.
Kristen Ulrich.
And 45 is 283.
And you go too fast. I'm sorry.
Got it.
28. The last one?
Yeah.
283. Yeah.
I put them on the side where it's good up here. Oh, well,
Yeah, rather than trying to jump back and forth between the two sheets. Yeah, because that was crazing you. Yeah.
oh, I thought we were supposed to do both of them.
Mr. Chair,
No problem.
was that the last ticket, Mr. Chair?
That was it, number
Okay.
45.
And just rest assured, anybody who's watching and was hearing a little bit of confusion at the end relative to where we're at 43 or 45 or what have you, we will review the tape and we will get this exact, and and I will have that by hopefully tomorrow. So if anybody calls who hasn't had the privilege of watching this tonight, I can tell them where they were ranked.
Well, there are also three different people doing it, so there should be two of them that would track correct. But thank you very much, Mick.
Oh, in any case, thank you very much, all of you, for helping with this.
All right. If there are no questions or comments on that section, then we can go on to the harbor berthing policy.
Recommendation that Harbor Commission receive a report on the berthing policy for designated commercial fishing slips in Santa Barbara Harbor and recommend to City Council amendments to that policy regarding earnings requirements from commercial fishing and methods of reporting those earnings.
Mr. Chair, in March of 2001, City Council approved a policy designating commercial fishing slips in the harbor that would be berths in the harbor that would be for commercial fishing only. And the policy was designed to set standards that need to be maintained, set earnings requirements in order to provide, if you will, sort of a firewall, sort of a protection, sort of a designated area of the harbor that would be dedicated to what is a century-old tradition in this harbor of commercial fishing, and basically do our best to protect those slips and ensure they remain occupied by legitimate commercial fishermen so that we're able to do what we can to maintain that important aspect of our working waterfront. The resolution that was passed and adopted by Council in 2001 had a lot of sections to it, outlining the program and the parameters and the earnings requirements, and it also called for a 5-year review of that policy. That review was undertaken in 2007. One significant change was made to the earnings requirement, and another change that was made to the policy was changing the 5-year review to a 3-year review. Albeit somewhat belatedly, we are here tonight to undertake that 3-year review. By way of background also, there are a total of 42 designated commercial fishing slips that Council established as part of this policy. And you see them on this slide here. They include all of what we call Fish Float North, all of what we call Fish Float South. That's in front of our administrative offices. Fish Float North's on the north side of the city pier. And then 18 of the slips in Marina 1A, with the exclusion of 2 against the headwalk and the 1 on the end tide, which is occupied by a workboat. The slips, when the policy was established, the slips on Fish Float North and the slips on Fish Float South, the owners of boats permitted to those slips were permitted grandfather status. That is, they were grandfathered in at a slip fee that is significantly reduced from the slip fee that is currently paid by other slip permittees in the harbor, and they were not held to the earnings requirements. They basically had, as it sounds like, the grandfather clause. Many of them were older fishermen, some of them who have passed on since then, who were here when these docks were established in the early 1970s. In fact, some of them even helped construct those docks. And the same privilege was afforded to the folks in Marina 1A with one caveat. And part of that is due to the fact that they have better amenities on Marina 1A. They actually have dock fingers as opposed to being Mediterranean moored up against the dock and tied to pilings. And the offer that was made to those folks, and it's captured in this policy, was that they had the choice. They could be grandfathered in, or they could choose to take the slip fee reduction commensurate with what was being offered to the folks in Fish Float North and Fish Float South in exchange for having the fishing earnings requirements applied to them. Since that time, there have been some of the folks in Marina 1A took the city up on that offer, decided to call it the I'll Go Fishing Clause, and took that offer. Others didn't. And since that time, there have been several transfers into some of these slips. And anybody transferring into the slips, as it's articulated in the policy, must make the earnings requirements, even if it was a grandfathered slip they came into. It's our grandfather clause only applies until the slip transfers to somebody else. That's quite frankly part of the whole idea. Was it as that generation of fishermen moves on to other pursuits, people taking their place in those slips would pay the going tear. But the half rate tear, but they would not be applied the entire slip fees as are paid by the rest of the folks in the harbor. And so currently we have 31 people out of the 45 vessels berthed in designated commercial fishing slips. And you might say, well, why 45, Mick? You pointed out 42 here. Well, the other 3 were designated commercial slips that were added during the Marina 1 and 4 expansion project in 1999, reflecting a percentage and a preference that was articulated in the 1996 Harbor Master Plan. It was deemed that 2 of the designated slips in Marina 1, when we built RS and Q Finger, and 2 of the slips in Marina 4, we expanded Marina 4 a bit. Excuse me, 1 of the slips in Marina 4 would be designated commercial fishing slips only. And so here tonight, what I'd like to do is show you just the substantive changes that staff has proposed in the current resolution. That's the resolution that was passed in 2007. You'll see in a strike-through version and attachment in your attachment 2 to this report what we propose to be changed. We're not going to dwell on the small clarifications, though I'm happy to answer any questions about those. And what I'd like to do is go over the 3 sections in order where we believe there are substantive changes worth looking at and worth considering. The first occurs in Section 4. By way of explanation, the way that the department, and we've wrestled with this for years, verifies earnings from commercial fishing, the rule right now, as you can see at the top of there, is you need to show the department demonstrate $15,000 worth of commercial fishing earnings in any given 2-year cycle. And the problem really hasn't been great. What we've asked people to do is show us copies of fish landing receipts, California Department of Fish and Game fish landing receipts reflecting earnings in that amount, or the total at least that amount. But here's one small rub in that regard. Typically, most fishermen who sell to buyers at the pier, let's say wholesalers and what have you, those buyers are the ones who are sent the fish landing receipt books from the California Department of Fish and Game. This is what I'm about to describe as sort of the traditional model. The buyer comes down to the dock, they unload your fish, they make out the amount, the landings, the dollars paid, and the block number where the fish were taken, the vessel ID number and the vessel name. And one copy goes to the buyer, one copy goes to the fisherman, and one copy goes to the Department of Fish and Game. Well, in recent years, and I want to say it goes back probably about 15 years, the department expanded its licensing regimen, if you will, and a lot because there was this there was an increase in the number of fishermen who wished to sell directly to the public, like our Saturday morning fisherman's market, which has actually become a booming thing in many ports. Folks advertise on the internet. They get all kinds of clientele ready. The folks are lined up at the dock waiting for them when they arrive. And it's also for folks that wanted to sell directly to retailers and, quite frankly, bypass the wholesale part of it. And so the department developed both retail and fish receivers licenses, I believe they're called. And in those cases, the landings books go directly to the producer, to the fisherman. And so the fisherman theoretically keeps a copy for himself, a copy goes to the state, and a copy goes to the people to whom he sold the fish. That being the case, we have had situations where we were concerned that people who had receivers licenses and or retail licenses had the capacity to fill out a fish landing receipt, show it to the department, and no receipt ever got sent to Sacramento. In other words, there's opportunity here for an end run around the program, if you will. And since the program is designed to keep the honest fishermen honest and really be a bulwark for the commercial fishing industry, what we're proposing here, Mr. Chair, is to add as part of the requirement for demonstrating your earnings from fish landings for the 2-year period is a copy from the custodian of records in Sacramento, or excuse me, it's in Alameda, the licensing branch, that demonstrates those earnings. Now, what a fisherman can do, and you can see an attachment of a request form, is attachment 3 in this document. You can see in this attachment that you can send up to the Department of Fish and Game and request to have them send you one of these. It's free of charge, and it actually will be signed and stamped by the custodian of records at Fish and Game. What you can do is you can check any given year on the sheet, and then when they send it down to you, the whole year's record of your landings and value will be there, every single landing you made that was reported to the state. What a fisherman can do, given the fact, and understandably we're very sensitive to this, that this is proprietary information. They may not want to splay out in front of the waterfront department, their entire earnings for the year. They should feel free to black out anything they want as long as what remains equals $15,000 total for us. That way we have the assurance that the records they've shown to us are also being shown to the state of California. It's a matter, again, of keeping honest folks honest. It's a belt and suspenders. There's no extra cost other than a little bit of pain in the neck for a fisherman once every 2 years to send up to Sacramento. They'll fax this sheet down to them, and we believe it a pretty simple fix to close that loophole. The next change we wanted to make was that in Section 5, you'll see that ever since the resolution was adopted by City Council, there's been an opportunity for people to earn at least half of their earnings aboard boats other than the one that is assigned to their their permitted designated commercial fishing slip. It was brought to our attention by folks who fish salmon in Bristol Bay, Alaska. It was brought to our attention by folks who are deckhands in the winter on sea urchin boats. How do we, staff, how do we prove to you that we have, these landings? Because they won't get landing receipts from these earnings, because they won't get landing receipts from California Department of Fish and Game. So what we've done here is we've added language. We're trying to be as reasonable as possible. All we're looking for is proof that you actually, worked that other 50%. And quite frankly, I can't think of anybody since the program began. There may have been one or two who've actually needed to go to the other 50%. But in any case, we're asking for a canceled payroll check or their equivalent plus copies of their IRS Service Form 1099 to serve as, again, just another way of demonstrating to us that you made those earnings, especially if they weren't made on the boat assigned to the slip that is the designated commercial fishing slip. And finally, our last change is related to this, but there's also a clause in the resolution that allows for folks who have been at it for some time. I think it's 3 consecutive, 3 complete, it's at the top there, and successive earnings periods, beginning with the earnings periods when the resolution was changed to include this notion back in 2007. That's why we struck out the language referencing the adoption of this resolution and put in its place the date that resolution was adopted in 2007. May lease their boats and acquire those earnings or meet those earning standards through a lease that the waterfront director approves as being a valid lease. And the idea here is that when fishermen start, quite frankly, to get older and the work becomes tougher and their joints wear out if they're crab fishermen, or they endure physical challenges and what have you, that they're allowed to keep their business going. Because the point is to have working boats working. The point isn't to be owners for any given individual. The point is to have boats and fishing slips fishing. And so we crafted language that the council passed, the Harbor Commission and Council approved of in 2007, allowing 50% of the earnings to have all of the earnings be approvable to a lessee through a lease that the waterfront director has seen and approved. And here we thought it was consistent with the last section you just reviewed to allow 50% of those earnings to be on another boat by that lessee in that permitted slip by the same mechanism that I just described to you in the last slide. In other words, what we're requiring is 100% of the earnings have to come from the lessee, but the lessee may have opportunities in Bristol Bay, Alaska, on an urchin boat or something like that too. So we're trying to apply to them or offer to them the same opportunities as offered to the folks we talked about in the previous slide, who are the slip permittees and do something else on the side once they've earned do up to 50% of their earnings. Demonstrated by fishing on other boats. So those are the only major changes. I'd be happy to answer any questions. And by way of just so you know, I convened a meeting of fishermen, 8 fishermen who have generally been involved in the past and are representative of this group of 31, and it was very difficult. Fishermen are busy, they fish, and it's very difficult to time a meeting so everybody can stop what they're doing for the day, especially in the middle of lobster season, and come to a meeting. But they were gracious enough to do so. And the one thing we added since the meeting was the language about the custodian of records. And I was reminded of that by a fisherman, and I had an email exchange with him where I hope that I clarified the fact that it's not draconian, it's not intended to peer into people's proprietary business. It's just another means of reflecting that they've demonstrated the appropriate earnings requirements. And with that, Mr. Chair, I would conclude this part of the presentation. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mick. I just want to be clear. This is just a report. You're not expecting the commission to take any kind of an action on this, correct?
No, it says to recommend to the City Council amendments that are on the policy regarding earnings.
Okay.
This resolution has to be adopted by council, Mr. Chair.
All right. Very good. In my summary, Mary, you missed it. Okay, which is what I run the meeting off of. Okay. So any comments or questions? Okay, Commissioner Spicer, I mean. Boy, I'm really good tonight, I tell you.
Thank you, Mick. I have one small question on Section 5. If somebody is working in a different locale, and you mentioned Bristol Bay, Alaska, is it traditional that they're paid with a check cut from an accountant or an account, or is it usually done in cash? I'm just curious, and if that put an onerous on them.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Spicer, it's an excellent question. I'd be far be it for me to suggest that it's a cash business, but I think that it's not unusual. What all we would want to see would be something from a payroll book, or something that would reflect the fact that they were paid the cash. If somebody was paid cash and chose to keep that, not as part of their public, doings, their public business doings, it might be a little difficult for them to prove to us that they actually earned that money or demonstrated their compliance with the earnings standards. But we're open to I put payroll payroll checks or their equivalent, and so that's sort of an open door for somebody to be able to prove to the Waterfront Department staff's satisfaction that they actually undertook those earnings. Sure.
Any other comments or questions? Commissioner Sloan.
Yeah, I have a comment and a question. On this Section 5 and the corresponding one in Section 13, we asked for a canceled payroll check or their equivalent plus copies of a 1099. If you get a payroll check, you don't get a 1099, you get a W-2. So it might be 1099 or W-2. Because if it's equivalent and they're an independent contractor, you would get 1099. So
Thank you very much for that.
being an accountant.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you.
The other question I had was on 13, and it talks about 3 complete and successive earning periods. Well, is an earning period a 2-year period or a 1-year period?
A 2-year period.
Okay, so they'd have to be after 6 years from 2007.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, 2013 would be the first time folks would be eligible to take advantage of this.
To lease it. Okay, thanks.
Any other comments or questions? And it's it seems fairly complicated, but actually if you read it through, it's not too complicated. But that's why Commissioner Friedman is going to give it back to us. No, I'm just kidding you. So if there are no other comments or questions, is there a motion to approve the recommendation on the berthing policy? Oh, excuse me. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't have any forms filed.
While we're doing that, I think we need to make a motion, to add the language.
Oh, the or.
W-2. Do we need to do that?
Okay.
Why don't you make the motion and I'll second.
I would suggest you do that as part of your motion, including
Right,
the
we'll
amendments
correct
that you
that.
suggested.
I'd like to make a comment saying I really appreciate the consideration for the fishermen and the difficulties in this that the Waterfront Department shows. It's
Right?
All right. And so, let's get my right glasses on here. So, Ray Kennedy wanted to speak with us on this issue.
Thank you. Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Ray Kennedy. I've been a commercial fisherman in Santa Barbara for the last 20 years. I'm a boat owner and a slip permit holder for slip 4B42. A slip assigned to me by the commercial priority during the harbor expansion of 1999. I'm here tonight to address an anomaly in the commercial pricing berthing policy regarding these 3 slips assigned through the commercial priority in that expansion. Although 19% of the harbor expansion was designated to be commercial, only 3 slips were actually assigned by commercial priority. While you may hear language of preferential consideration regarding these 3 slips, the phrase commercial priority was in fact the language. The anomaly that exists is the fact that these slips are held responsible to fulfilling the commercial restriction requirements, while they are the only commercially restricted slips that do not qualify for commercial slip rates. This lack of consistency in waterfront policy is my issue. A slip that is held under commercial restriction should benefit from commercial rates regardless of how the slip was assigned. The identification of 42 historic fishing slips should certainly now include the 3 assigned fishing slips in question, as history has certainly been well established over the last 12 years. As well noted, commercial fishing is quite beneficial to Santa Barbara Harbor while providing employment, supporting local services and businesses, and infusing the local economy with substantial local commercial fishing income. In case we forget, commercial fishing is the main reason that affordable dredging operations are available on a yearly basis to keep our harbor open. To this end, an equitable and consistent commercial berthing pricing policy is necessary. Given the current embattled state of California fisheries, facing further regulations, restrictions, and closures, it is more important than ever to provide a conducive environment in Santa Barbara to prosper rather than fail as commercial fishermen. As such, I appeal to your logic and your sense of equality and encourage you as the Commission to include these 3 slips in question in consistency with all other commercial slips at commercial rates. If these slips are to be held under commercial restriction, then provide comparable commercial rates. Otherwise, if these slips are not to be afforded commercial rates, then drop the commercial restrictions. I would encourage you as the Harbor Commission to establish consistency in your support for commercial fishing in Santa Barbara. That's all I have. I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you.
I would ask the question, Mick, how do the 3 slips, when you gave your presentation, I was under just in hearing it, the assumption that they would operate under the same formula as the other commercial slips.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, I specifically spoke to Marina 1A. I didn't specifically speak to those 3, but I'm glad you bring it up, and I know Mr. Kennedy and I have exchanged extensive emails on this subject over the last couple of months. The reason that those 3 slips don't enjoy the opportunity to have the quote-unquote commercial fishing berthing rate is because unlike the slips in Marina 1A, unlike the slips in the fish floats north and south, these individuals were allowed to leapfrog, if you will, to jump the waiting list during the Marina 1 expansion, the Marina 1 and 4 expansion in 1999, and enjoyed a considerable preference. They jumped quite a few people to get to the number 1 spot and be awarded a slip permit in those areas. It's staff's perspective that to layer privilege upon preference would not be appropriate, would not be good public policy. It would not be consistent with our thinking in this regard in terms of what the priorities are, what the benefits should accrue to the commercial fishermen out of this program. We believe that the benefit of being able to go to number 1 on the slip waiting list in Santa Barbara Harbor is quite a privilege, quite a preferential treatment, and to add on top of that the additional privilege of half rates, and it's not half rates, it's actually close to that, but not, would not be appropriate. And Ray and I think, have agreed to disagree on this, but I certainly welcome your input.
Okay, and then I guess the other comment, well, let me ask other commissioners, because normally I don't dive in first. Does anybody else have comments or questions they wish to make? Commissioner Friedman.
To follow up on that, Mick, was the decision made by the at the time by the Harbor Commission or the Council to make those preferential slips for commercial fishing? And then if so, were there others who had applied, or were there just these 3 that applied? So was there a policy decision that was made that basically designated these to be commercial slips, and then were these the only that qualified? Because it seems that I understand what you're saying, and this is the first I've heard of this. I haven't got my hands around it completely. But if there was a policy decision made at the Harbor Commission or City Council level, and then they just applied based on that policy decision, and the only way that they could even fulfill that would be to jump up to the top, then I think he has a point in what he's saying. I understand what you're saying, but I don't think that. Well, that's basically my question. Was it a policy decision on the one hand, and then was the only way to fulfill that policy decision for them to jump?
If by policy decision you mean reflecting guidelines of the Harbor Master Plan, the answer would be yes. And I believe that is the only way that they could have achieved that preference articulated. And I believe it was specifically related to new construction as it was articulated in the Harbor Master Plan. The only way they could get there was by going to the top of the list. And my recollection is that these were the only 3 individuals on the slip waiting list for those size slips, but I could be mistaken there. But you're correct on both accounts. It was policy, and that was the mechanism by which they got there.
And just a further, not clarification relative to commercial fishing, but there was another class of boater or individual. When we expanded Marina One in '98, there were a number of moorings in that location, and there were boats on moorings. Those mooring permittees held a preference also and were given the ability to jump ahead per the Harbor Master Plan policy in front of people who are on the wait list in order to accommodate a location for them. So there were two classes of boaters, or whatever you want to call it, that were given that preferential opportunity.
Well, I'd just like to add, I'm not sure the process, but to bring this back and after we've had a chance maybe to review the plan, because I think he has a point that if the only way to fulfill the intent, what I'm hearing is the intent of the master plan was to have these extra spaces for commercial fishing, and the only way to achieve that was to have the individuals jump. They shouldn't be penalized for fulfilling a policy need. That's just my initial take on it, because if there was no way for them to jump, then how do we even achieve that in the plan? Why was it even in the plan unless I think all business should be treated equally. And I understand that they jumped, but then that was based on policy, though. So that's why maybe if there's a way, and I don't even know if we can decide that tonight, because I don't know if that was agendized as a Brown Act. I'm not even sure if we should bring it back or not. I just want to understand it more, because I think he raises a valid point, and I think you raise a valid point too. And like I said, this is the first I've heard of that argument.
And again, I'm not saying we can't agendize it or talk about it further. We certainly can. But when you say they are being penalized, I'm not sure how they're being penalized, because if that is being applied to the commercial fishing vessels, why wouldn't the mooring permittees be in the same situation? They weren't paying anywhere near slip rates when they came off a mooring ball permit. I think there might have been $50 a month. I don't even remember what they were, to be paying current slip rates. So I think the application was that anybody who received a slip permit as part of the expansion of the harbor, whether you were a mooring permittee or you were a commercial fisherman or you were a recreational boater, you weren't going to receive some preferential treatment in terms of a reduction of slip rates. Yeah, you would have a restriction in terms of having to demonstrate your ability to be a commercial fisherman in the long run in order to receive, if you will, that preference. Because if you weren't going to fish, you shouldn't have necessarily got that slip as part of that process.
So just one last question. So at the time, then they came into that knowing that was going to be the case, that the other fishing slips had that preference, but they wouldn't. they knew that at the time that they applied for it. That was the case then.
Boy, you're taxing some memory here. Now, I don't know if Mick remembers or not.
Well, let me see if I can clarify a couple things and get to the heart of what we're talking about here. When the folks who came off the moorings, most of them went to the fish floats, who ultimately, have been grandfathered in. Some of them, came to the fish floats, and those have been grandfathered in. But the important thing to remember is that they already had the equivalent of a slip in Santa Barbara Harbor. They had a place to berth their boat. So it was unrelated to the slip waiting list issue, the slip waiting list question. Our perspective is that albeit reflecting guidelines in the Harbor Master Plan, right, going to the top of the waiting list and getting a slip is actually a huge preference. And quite frankly, it's difficult for me to understand how them paying standard slip fees where they might still be waiting for a slip, because there are plenty of fishermen in Santa Barbara Harbor who've been bouncing around on visitor rates month after month, hard-working fishermen, and Ray is a hard-working fisherman. I've known Ray for a long time. He's one of our best producers in the harbor. But there are folks who don't have a slip who are bouncing all over the harbor, and the very opportunity to have a slip, I believe, is a preference that far outweighs the argument that he should be granted further privilege relative to slip reduction.
Okay. Commissioner Anakuchin.
Thank you. I'm somewhat confused, primarily because I'm not intimately involved in this sort of thing on a day-to-day basis, as you people are. But let me ask the question, when these 3 slips became available, either actually or in concept, they were designated as commercial fishing slips. And there were 3 people that had boats in the harbor that now move their boats to these slips. That is not true?
I can't verify the fact they had boats. They had boats in the harbor. I can't verify the fact they were on the slip waiting list. And there's no requirement on to be on the slip waiting list that you have a boat, period, let alone a boat in the harbor.
Okay, then let me ask, how were these 3 slips advertised to the boating community in Santa Barbara Harbor?
They weren't. These slips were assigned the way we typically assigned slips. Not just those 3, but all of the slips were assigned the typical way we assign slips on the slip waiting list. But where commercial fishermen were identified on the slip waiting list, and there were identifying indications on the slip waiting list, recreational, commercial fishing, and just commercial, quite frankly, I think was another category. Those 3 individuals who were on the slip waiting list, who were designated commercial fishing, were allowed to leap into the slips of the commensurate size for which they had applied. Remember, the slip waiting list was and still is to a degree divided into slip size categories. And if there's a slip size category, if they were on the list in a certain slip size category that applied to the available slip that was in Marina 4 and the 2 in Marina 1, they were allowed to go to the top of the list and go into those slips. One of the major differences is there were no parameters. This policy didn't go into place until 2001, in part because, and not unrelated to, we had now 45 designated commercial fishing slips in the harbor and no rules and regulations relative to, what's to say they're commercial fishing, right? And the decision was made at that time to use the 42 that we talked about before as the heart of the policy, let the other 3 exist as they existed, and join the preference for jumping to the top of the waiting list and pay standard slip fee rates. It was a conscious decision.
Okay. I'll come back.
Thank you.
I'll come back to you, Commissioner Sloan.
Are there other commercial fishermen in the harbor besides the ones that we talked about here and the 3 here that are And do they get a discounted rate?
Depending on the season, we have up to 100 boats that fish out of Santa Barbara. Some of them are visitors, and a lot of them are slip permittees. Some of them are on the Cuda Dock lease, down in front of the Maritime Museum, some of the Radins there. But yes, there are dozens, I want to say, of fishermen who are either visitors or who have permanent slips in Santa Barbara Harbor and pay standard month-to-month slip fee rates.
Okay, thank you.
Just had one quick last comment. I think you clarified my questions on your last comments. Was this whole issue was discussed back in 2001 about these three, and that was the decision that was made by the Harbor Commission back then on this issue? So this wouldn't be the first time this was brought up. This was specifically an issue back in 2001.
That's correct. It was explained in 2001 why, the grandfather clause would exist, why the opportunities for the folks in Marina 1A would enjoy the opportunity to exchange their grandfather status for paying the commercial fish, for demonstrating commercial fishing earnings. And I don't have the record in front of me, but I can't imagine it wasn't discussed or acknowledged that these three slips would be paying the standard commercial fishing rate. The standard slip fee rate.
And again, it was very similar to what we did with the mooring boat vessels. They weren't given any preferential slip rates, even though they went from a mooring can permit fee to a slip in Santa Barbara Harbor. The point of the Harbor Master Plan was to accommodate for the fact that they were going to be displaced and they needed a place to go. And the Harbor Master Plan also required that we designate some portion of the newly created slips towards supporting and maintaining our working harbor by giving them to commercial fishing.
Any other comments or questions? And I would probably add to that, John, that it's been 10 years since I read the Harbor Master Plan, and if you want to go to sleep at night, it's something you should put by your bedside table. But I think to address a point, Mr. Kennedy, and I want to thank you very much because, as you see, you spurred a very nice discussion here. The reason that we can't change the designation of the slip that you're currently in is because, if I understand correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the Harbor Master Plan says those are indeed supposed to be commercial fishing slips? Mick?
Mr. Chair, yes and no. You can't change the designation, but you could change the rate as per Mr. Kennedy's request. We're recommending against it, but you could do that.
Right. No, but I mean...
You could recommend changing the rate.
Correct. Okay. So hopefully that last comment was clear to the Commission, if anybody was unclear on that. Okay. So, are there any other comments or questions? We have a recommendation in front of us. Does anyone, or we have actually a proposal, does anyone want to make a motion on this recommendation, and it does need a one-word change?
Since I'm the one that brought up the technicality, I guess I'll make the motion to accept the recommendation with a change that we include the additional tax form.
Okay. Is there a second to that motion?
I'll second.
All right. Is there any further discussion before we call for the vote? All right. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Passed unanimously. Whew. The lease agreement with the Blue Water Hunter.
Recommendation that Harbor Commission recommend council approval of a 5-year lease with Andrew Taylor, doing business as Blue Water Hunter, at a monthly rent of $2,221, subject to annual CPI increases for the 878 square foot retail store located at 117D Harbor Way.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, Andy Taylor relocated Blue Water Hunter from its former location in Goleta to 117D Harbor Way following a competitive request for proposals process back in February of 2001. Blue Water Hunter specializes in free diving and spear fishing equipment and also custom-made Deep Thought brand custom wetsuits. In addition to freediving supplies, Blue Water Hunter also sells and services and repairs scuba equipment and provides air fills, inspection, and testing for scuba tanks at the store. So although he does cater to the freediving spearfishing community, he does offer scuba support as well. The company has a website and sells equipment via the internet at www.blueh20.com. And Blue Water Hunter also coordinates multi-day boat trips catering strictly to freedivers, no scuba divers allowed on these trips, to the Channel Islands and Cortez Bank, a spectacular diving area down south. And Mr. Taylor has approximately 9 trips scheduled between March and September of this year. As Mary read, the proposed term is for 5 years at an initial base rent of $2,221 per month, subject to annual cost of living increases based on the Consumer Price Index. And he has a variety of percentage rent categories, very similar to the paddle sports lease, ranging from 1% to 10% of gross sales. For instance, 1% is the fees collected, 1% of gross sales for fees collected on organizing the charter boat trips. That's largely a pass-through. He doesn't make money to speak of on those. He simply coordinates them and then sells the spaces out to the passengers. 5% on wetsuits and scuba equipment, and 10% on rentals, books, videotapes, clothing, and so forth. Blue Water Hunter is in good standing with the department, and we recommend approval of this 5-year lease. Thank you.
Are there any comments or questions for Scott? Thank you, Scott, for the presentation. Commissioner Sloan.
Just a couple of points of clarification. So the percentage rents here, are they the same as the previous lease?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Sloan, yes, they are identical.
And do they include the internet sales?
Excuse me, I didn't catch that.
You said that he sells equipment through the internet as website. So do we get a portion of that?
Yes, internet sales are subject to revenue reporting and percentage rent payments as well.
Great, thanks.
Any other comments or questions? Appears to be very straightforward. Is there a motion to accept the recommendation? Okay. Is there a second to that motion? No. Okay. Any further discussion before we call for the vote? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Passes unanimously. And finally, the fiscal year budget.
Recommendation that Harbor Commission A receive a staff presentation on the Waterfront Department's proposed fiscal year 2012 and fiscal year 2013 budget submittal. B, recommend approval of a $25 per linear foot slip transfer fee increase in fiscal year 2012 and fiscal year 2013 on all slip categories except 20-foot slips. C, recommend approval of a 3% slip fee increase in fiscal year 2012 and a 2% slip fee increase in fiscal year 2013. And D, forward a recommendation to City Council for approval of the Waterfront Department's proposed fiscal year 2012 and fiscal year 2013 budget and incorporation into the city budget process.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, some of this may look quite familiar to you, so I will not belabor these points. The presentation outline is much like the overview from last month. We'll look at the fiscal year 2011, the current fiscal year revenue forecasts, which we extrapolate out for our fiscal year 2012 and 2013 revenue projections, and we will also provide the expense projection or budget. We'll look at fee changes and adjustments and reserve balances. The main difference between tonight's meeting and last month's meeting is that we have a recommendation before you to forward to council if approved. Again, the fiscal year end revenue is a forecast based on our mid-year December 31st, 2010 actual results. According to where we were at mid-year, we could end the year 3.8% under our budget, or $444,000 under budget. That is conservative. It could be less than that because we have seen a bit of a pickup in slip transfer fees, which is the biggest shortfall in this current year's budget. We'll know more about that when the third quarter figures become available through the end of March, and that'll be available in mid-April. We can take another look at this and see how we're doing revenue-wise. Some of the challenges and just issues that we're looking at for this two-year budget are that revenues are down in the current fiscal year, largely due to economy, but as we discussed last month, also somewhat to weather, including slip transfer fees, visitor fees, parking, and interest revenue. We're not proposing any increases in permanent staffing. The Waterfront Department has had 46 full-time, actually 45 and three-quarter employees for quite some time now. Possible continuation of unpaid furlough, as was the case in the past 2 years. Actually, I'll say that that is a likely continuation of the furlough at this point. And another one of the challenges, of course, is the increasing debt service as we continue the build-out of Marina One. The debt service will continue to climb in these next 2 years. And we have identified $2.3 million in capital projects that we've left unfunded in the next budget cycle, but we did identify them so that should things improve, we can put them back on the schedule. Moving along to expenditures by program, administration is the biggest of the 9 programs the Waterfront Department has. That's administration and community relations program. We'll show a breakdown of that on the next slide. I just wanted to touch on a few of the larger programs and give you some of the high points, the bigger expenditure items in some of the bigger programs, starting with the Harbor Patrol program. So you can see the 2012 projected expenditures for the Harbor Patrol program is $2 million, and $1.8 million of that $2 million is salaries and benefits. Is by far the bulk of the Harbor Patrol program because there are quite a few officers in that program. Harbor maintenance is one of our largest programs, and some of the big ticket items in there are $606,000 of that is what we call facilities maintenance, which is the big ticket item. In that facilities maintenance item is a subset of our Work Incorporated contract that provides janitorial services throughout the harbor, both in the marinas and on the land side as well. And that's a $220,000 contract. Additionally, some of the other big ticket items in the harbor maintenance program are a $240,000 a year electric bill for the marinas in the harbor area, $130,000 a year for water, $229,000 a year for landscaping maintenance provided by the Parks and Recreation Department, and approximately $100,000 for Harbor Patrol boat maintenance is budgeted. So that's a breakdown on some of the bigger items. We expect expenditures to increase 1.3% from fiscal year 2011 to next year, fiscal year 2012, or about $157,000. It's slightly more than we projected at last month's meeting. At the Budget Committee meeting, Commissioners Kelly and Kramer requested that we break out the administration and communications line item and community relations line item because it is such a big line item. And of course, that's because of the debt service on our 4 debt service items, and the capital outlay transfer comes out of administration as well. And there was some conversation last week with the city administrator and the finance director about maybe putting the debt service and capital outlay transfer under a different program so that administration and community relations doesn't seem so overwhelmingly huge. Maybe make it that a little more clear. Oh, and in the administration and community relations line item itself on the top row there, the big ticket items in there are salaries and benefits to the tune of $600,000, allocated costs of $830,000, which includes $530,000 in overhead allocation. So those are the big items in the administration and community relations budget. Recommended fee changes that we're going to discuss tonight are increase in the slip transfer fee of $25 a foot in fiscal year 2012 and again in fiscal year 2013, except for the 20-foot slips, which will remain at $200 per foot as they have for several years. That will bring the per foot slip transfer fee rate to $300 a foot in fiscal year 2012 and $325 a foot in fiscal year 2013. Additionally, staff is recommending a 3% slip fee increase in fiscal year 2012. That would take place on July 1st of this calendar year. We expect that to generate approximately $134,000 in additional revenue. That figure does include approximately $18,000 in revenue generated from the 4 new slips recently built out in P-Finger. Another issue that has come to the surface is that the new self-pay parking systems, which we'll talk about a little bit more about later on, these are the systems that accept credit cards, cash, or coin that we're going to begin phasing in this fiscal year, 2 of them. They do not offer the ability to recognize a disabled placard or license plate. And currently, in our budget and our fee resolution for the waterfront, there is a half-price discount for folks that have these blue disabled parking placards or disabled person's license plate. Since the system doesn't have the ability to recognize that, it complicates monitoring it somewhat. So we're recommending discontinuing that discount, and we've discussed that at length with the city attorney's office, and that is not in conflict with the California Vehicle Code or the Department of Motor Vehicles. And if there are any questions on that, we can talk about that later as well. So fiscal year 2012 revenue by program. This has not changed, I believe, at all since last month, so we won't belabor the issue, but just a very minor revenue increase is expected with 2011 compared to 2012. That's mostly due to the decline in slip transfer fees, somewhat mitigated by the increase in slip fees themselves, and we also are expecting that we will begin to see those slip transfer fee revenue hit bottom and hopefully begin to slowly come back to earlier levels. This graphic shows the debt service coverage ratios on the waterfront department's certificates of participation bond and also the Department of Boating and Waterways loan. Part of the requirement, the continuing disclosure requirement of the Department of Boating and Waterways loan is that we need to maintain a debt coverage ratio of 1.5, which is that our net revenue after expense needs to be 1.5 times what our annual debt service payment is. And as you can see, we can maintain that. We're projecting that will be maintained through the end of this 6-year cash flow model, at which point it dips slightly below the required amount of 1.5, the ratio of 1.5. But that'll change as we move forward through the 6-year cash flow, because generally we receive, except for the last 2 years, have been kind of an anomaly, but usually we end up the year with a little bit more revenue than we projected, and we almost always end the year with less expense than we projected. So those are conservative projections, and so you'll see those lines widen out a little bit as we move forward. But it's just something to keep our eye on as we move forward through the ensuing years to make sure we don't drop below that level of 1.5 and stay in compliance with our loan agreements with the state. This graphic shows the operating revenue versus operating expense. The black line is the operating revenue and the red line is the expense. And as you can see, fortunately, they don't cross during this next 6 years. We wanted to show this to you in graphic form instead of the spreadsheet form that we showed last month to make it a little simpler to grasp and understand. And the reserve balances, the darker green bars on the bottom represent the projected funds remaining in the Harbor Preservation Fund. Those are required to be maintained above $2 million, which is indicated by that red line. You can see that the Harbor Preservation Fund over the years gradually diminishes. That's because the Harbor Preservation Fund also serves as the waterfront's capital fund. So as we fund capital projects moving forward that aren't funded by Department of Boating and Waterways loans and grants, we need to dip into these reserves as they were intended to do our capital projects. But it does remain above the $2 million level under this scenario 6 years out. The lighter green is simply the operating fund reserve requirements, which is 25% of our operating budget. So as you can see, we'll these projections keep the reserves above the required minimums. The department's the city's P3 program is how we refer to the city's performance measurement program, and this program consists of measurable objectives as well as program objectives. And we just put down 3 of the highlights of the program objectives for the next fiscal year. One of them I mentioned already. That's the parking services pay and display system. The objective is to begin installing pay and display system in the existing honor fee lots. Like I said, we plan to do 2 this fiscal year and 2 to 3 next fiscal year. In the marina management program, the objective is to accommodate increased cruise ship visits by working with the cruise lines, related government agencies, and the Conference and Visitors Bureau, and so forth. And in the facilities management program, the performance measure has to do with harbor electrolysis study, and that is to complete data gathering from other harbors regarding corrective action and enforcement on electrolysis issues, and prepare a report and report findings to Harbor Commission in the first quarter of fiscal year 2012. And what that's about is, Carl isn't here tonight to expound on that, but there have been some corrosion issues that have come up in the harbor, some electrolysis issues. We've hired an expert to study that, who's completed a preliminary report. We've reviewed that and is now preparing a final report, which we can use to evaluate and move forward and evaluate the waterfront department's electrical infrastructure, and also a way of dealing with boats that might be leaking electricity into the water, causing corrosion in their own boat or the neighboring boats. So that's the performance objective for the facilities program. So the recommendation, as mentioned before, is increasing the slip transfer fee $25 a foot, except for 20-foot slips, and increasing the slip fees 3% in fiscal year 2012 and 2% in fiscal year 2013, and also eliminating the discounted disabled parking placards. And that concludes the report. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Scott. Are there any comments or questions? Commissioner Sloan.
I'm sorry to have so many comments tonight. But just before we get started, I'd like to ask that we break this down and separate it into 2 different recommendations, one being the slip fee increase and then the other ones, because I'm going to have to recuse myself from the slip fee increase as I'm a slip holder.
Actually, the one that you're going to have to recuse yourself from is going to be the slip transfer fee, because that's the one that really goes over $250 a year. That'll be the one where you and I, as slip holders, will have to step out.
But I'm not planning on transferring a slip.
Well, you're not, but if you could.
Yeah.
Whereas the slip fee increase doesn't hit the $250 threshold.
Okay. I still think I'd like to
Okay,
step away.
it's your call.
It's just I don't feel good about it. So I'd just like
And
to
we will.
break it in 2.
Commissioner Sloan. Spicer. Boy, I'm good tonight, let me tell you.
Scott, I've got a couple questions, and they're unrelated. The first one is removal of the disabled parking. You said you've talked to the city attorney. There's no ADA issue, or you've reviewed all that?
Chairman Kelly, Commissioner Spicer, that's correct. We've reviewed that over several months with the city attorney's office. What the California Vehicle Code allows, and I have a printout from the DMV here with me in case we get that far down in the weeds, but the disabled person parking placard or license plate, it clearly states in the code that it allows them free. They don't have to pay parking meters in on-street parking. It does not apply to off-street parking lots, and airport does not offer a discount. Downtown parking offers an extended validation period, but not a discount per se. UCSB doesn't offer any discounts, so we've been looking around and making sure we're in line with the law, because some people will understandably get upset by this.
Next question was, and I apologize, they're jumping around. The graph you showed where the projection shows us going below our 1.5 ratio And I know you cautioned us that when we get to 2017 that probably won't happen. What is the penalty should we dip below?
Commissioner Spicer, that's a good question. This is part of the continuing disclosure with the loans that every year we report out how much we have in reserves and what we give them data on our budget performance and so forth. If we're making our debt service payments and we did our build out the way we have, it would be unlikely that they would come in and default us if we were a couple of points under that, if we're making the payments and so forth. In worst case scenario, the coverage ratio drops so far we can't afford the payments. We have a number of defaults. Theoretically, the loan is secured by collateral assignments of rents and leases, and they can come in and instead of paying the monthly Blue Water Hunter paying the monthly rent to the waterfront department, there's a clause in the lease that says you may have to pay it to the state in event of a default.
Gotcha. Okay. And then my last question was, what are the items that fall under marina management? And I know it's not a large expense or not a large revenue, but I was just curious what the items were.
Commissioner Spicer, marina management is a huge revenue generating program. That's where all your slip fees and so forth come in there. But it is a very small expense part of the program. Is that what you're asking about, what expenses are involved in there? It's several staff people. It's a very small program, very little materials, but for 2012, it's $233,000 in salaries and benefits, and $47,000 for materials. So for the most part, it's just the staff that works at the front counter and their supervisor.
Any other comments or questions? I'm going to go down to Commissioner Antolin.
Two questions. One on the slip fee increase. I think you may have explained this last time, but why the 3% and then the 2%?
Chairman Kelly, Commissioner Bantolin, this is a function of the 6-year cash flow, the big complicated spreadsheet that we sent out last month, and we just map it out 6 years in advance, and we plug in different numbers where we think what we think was realistic to achieve in terms of if we see a parking fee increase coming, we'll plug that in. If we get predictions from finance that interest revenue is going to go up, we plug that in and we see how it comes out, and then we make up the difference in some cases where we have to by programming in a slip fee increase. So to make it work with the increasing allocations that have been given to us over the last few years, as you'll recall, last year, the year before last, we took on the 4th of July fireworks, 3 restrooms in the waterfront and the dolphin fountain, and some other expenses. To make that all work, we programmed in a 4% slip fee increase last year and the year before, and then this year a 3%, and then hereafter at 2%, which we expect, which makes our 6-year cash flow work into the next 6 years. So we had to take a bump to make it over those new expenses that were allocated, but now that we're there, we're tapering off and getting back down to the 2% every year.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question, I know this is more for the council, but are there any salary and benefit increases scheduled for the Harbor Department this upcoming fiscal year?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Bantolin, there are no salary increases expected. There's no determination on what the final contracts will be. As you know, those are currently being negotiated for the upcoming fiscal year. But I think it's safe to say, based on my inner workings with the city administrator and other department heads, that there is nothing planned or proposed as part of that. There is no increase in benefits, but there's an increase in benefit costs because of, and I think you're familiar with this, the PERS rates will need to be adjusted, and so PERS costs to both the employee and to the city will be increased in terms of rates over the next 2 years. But nothing in terms of salary increases, and with the furloughs, although we get the time off, there's an actual reduction of about 5 to 6% in overall salary savings for the upcoming year if the furlough is equal to the amount that it was in the past fiscal year.
Thanks. I just wanted to make sure that that wasn't programmed into the budget, as part of the some of the increases that we showed on the expenditure side. So I appreciate that.
Commissioner Bantolin, if I could elaborate a little bit too, those furlough savings are not programmed into this budget, so we'll see less salary and benefit expense than we're showing you right now after those, if and when those are negotiated.
Okay, any other comments or questions? I'm going to put the last point, or the second to the last point before we got to that, spoke to something that is of concern for me, and that is when I look at the percentage of, and this is going to go back to the Harbor Master Plan, which I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, because like I said, it's 10 years, so it's all fuzzy-wuzzy, that we would not use the, and the four categories are the waterfront, the water-dependent, help me here, guys. The water-dependent service uses.
I think ocean-dependent or ocean-related uses.
Ocean-dependent uses to help unnecessarily, or something like that, with budgetary issues. So when I look at the expenditures, and I'm not saying that I have the solution to this, but this is my concern. When I look at the overall waterfront expenditures, we have 1.3%. But then when I look at what we're doing with our slip fees at $25 a whack, we're far outrunning our regular expenses. And then when I look at our percentage of increase in slip fees at 5%, we're far outrunning our percentage of increase in waterfront expenditures. So what's happening is we're shifting, and I'm just pointing this out to the other commissioners, we're shifting more and more of the load onto the users of the waterfront department, which are dependent on the water. They can't go anyplace else. They're trapped. And this is a grave concern of mine. And I don't have a real slick, there is no easy solution to this other than reducing the expenditures so that we don't have to continue to, because Scott very eloquently said it, the only movable number here is in the slip fee right now, and in the slip transfer fees. Our tenants are on long-term contracts. We can't change those. We recently changed our parking rates, and for good, bad, or indifferent, if I remember correctly, we did see a dip in our revenue. The year after, we increased the fees, so we have to go there gingerly. So I'm pointing that out as concerns that I have in how we're structuring our fee increases, because it does seem that an unnecessary group of them are falling on the harbor-dependent users of the waterfront department. So those were just comments that I wanted to put out there. So, any Commissioner Sloan?
Yeah, just a couple of comments. One, on this slide here before, I just can't leave this one, Scott, sorry. Could we use our reserve to pay down the debt if this ratio became upside down? Would that be one option that we would have?
Commissioner Sloan, I suppose under an extreme circumstance and a short-term circumstance, we could dip in. I mean, that's what the operating reserves are for, is for, correcting problems like that if we have a big economic hit.
Yeah, and if we did need to keep it above, we could pay down the note a little bit to keep that ratio healthy. Then that is an option. Yeah.
Mr. Chair, just a comment. One of the things we always try and caution, and I just want to do it both for us and for those that might be watching, This is a 6-year projection. We're doing a 2-year budget, and if you look, the 2-year budget, we're clearly fine in terms of this coverage ratio requirement. I'm convinced, as Scott tried to allude to, that by the time we get out to fiscal year 17, this will be a non-issue in terms of the coverage factor. In fact, we'll have an opportunity, Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's fiscal year 2013, where we can look at even refinancing the certificates of participation, which are different than the coverage ratio is 1.25, I believe there. It's not 1.50. And if we're able to reduce our debt there, this will improve because we'll have more money available that will actually be available for the DBAW loan in our overall surplus net revenues, if you will.
Okay, good point. I was just trying to clarify that we do have options, because when we show something that we're going to violate a covenant, I just want to make sure that we're all talking about what the options are. And I realize it's so far out that the crystal ball gets really foggy out there.
Okay.
So. And just one follow-up comment to Chairman Kelly's is that I understand what you were saying about, expenditures going up 1.3%, but then some of the other activities going up higher than that. But if you look at where the revenue comes from, about half our revenue comes from that marina management, which is predominantly where both the slip fee increase is and the transfer fee. Those are the two things that I believe are the two revenue line items for marina management. And so those would have to go up higher than 1.3% to cover it, if I follow.
Right, but that's exactly my point. We're raising those fees faster because that's our only elastic item.
Right, because we can't change the leases because we're in long-term, and
Correct.
we already changed the parking rates, and we saw that had a negative impact.
And this is a point that I've been making for a number of years now, that right now the only elastic item we have is the one with individuals that really can't leave.
Right.
So we need to look at something else, and which seems to be trying to slow down the percentage increase of expenditures, so we don't need to keep doing the other one, maybe in these difficult economic times. I mean, it's just I'm just bringing something out that's here.
Understand.
I don't know what to do about it, but it's there.
Well, Mr. Chair, may I suggest if that is a significant concern, that I don't want to say simple solution because there is none, but we give you a capital improvement program. The majority of the expenses here are related, I mean the big capital expenditures are related to capital improvements. If the commission is uncomfortable about the rate of expenditure, that's the area where you want to save. Now remember, much of those expenditures are put to the benefit of the users. Mm-hmm. We're improving the marina, which should improve their benefit of paying their fees. We are, in effect, keeping the facilities the way they would like them to be. We can reduce the operating expenses, but when we do that, we provide less service. And as an enterprise fund, when you provide less service, you run the risk of not generating as much revenue as you would want to continue to maintain. I understand the policy, which is in the Harbor Master Plan, as Commissioner Kelly pointed out. The policy is that we should not put an undue burden upon ocean-dependent, ocean-related uses as our first source of fee increase or revenue generation. Well, clearly, in my opinion, it is not our first source. It may be, to a degree, our only one currently. But as Scott pointed out, the last 2 years we were at 4%, and now we're reducing it to 3% for fiscal year 2012, and then to drop it again to 2%. So we are recognizing the fact that we can't just continue to go to slip fees as a slip fee increase. Relative to the $25 per lineal foot increase to transfer fees, as you know, we're trying to keep pace to a degree with what the benefit is of having a slip permit and what the potential benefit is to the slip permittee in the transfer. And I think it clearly outweighs currently, given the market values of those permits. We are cautious and have done so with the 20-footers when we think that that may be an impact of somebody getting into boating or being affordable to get into boating, to freeze the transfer fee, and we will do so in the future. So I want you to recognize that if the Commission is uncomfortable with the fee structure associated with those that are ocean dependent or ocean related, and actually almost all of them are, because you got to pay a fee for parking to park your car to go to the waterfront. So we try and keep that balance. But I would like you to think about going forward, if that's an uncomfortable area, we should look at the expenditure reductions, because I don't think a 2% or a 3% slip fee increase is unreasonable given the cost of goods and services. And as you see, we're really not increasing salary, benefits, or supplies and services. That would be the way to address these. And I agree, it's a cautionary note that we should continue to look forward to not be in a situation where we're pricing people out of coming to the waterfront.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley. Just go ahead, Commissioner Bantalon.
I just need something reconciled for me, if you will. So we're going to be raising slip fees 3% this year. We're raising slip transfer fees, what amounts to almost 5%. Yet somehow we're losing 3% in marina management. I don't understand how we're raising these fees. Presumably they're all full. Can you help me out with that there?
Commissioner Bantalon, that's strictly a function of the fluctuations in the slip transfer fee revenue, which we talked about last month, but it's, this fiscal year we forecast it at $620,000 in our budget and adopted that into the budget, and we had only realized $189,000 by mid-year. So that's why you're seeing increasing in the fees and a decrease in the revenue. The decrease in the revenue is somewhat canceling out the increases in the fees.
Okay, and then I see it comes back a little bit for 2013, but it still doesn't seem to keep pace with that, so the same would apply for that.
Yes, and when we were looking at this budget, we budgeted the slip transfer fee revenue more conservatively, about $425,000, slowly creeping up to $450,000 or so, incrementally over the next 6 years, because we don't know if we're going to be back to the heyday of 2007 when we were up over $600,000. So we're going to try and budget that more conservatively because it has proven to be so volatile.
And again, I think if staff felt that the increase in the fee was clearly the thing that would be affecting the amount of revenue we receive, as Commissioner Chair Kelly pointed out, when we increase parking fees, you run the risk that the more you increase them, you get more revenue, but you may get less parkers. So overall, your gross goes down. What Scott and I clearly did, probably in error, was anticipate this year that we would be back to $600,000 in slip fees when we budgeted that last year. We're not going to get there. It doesn't look like we have enough months left in the year, and the economy is not improved. It's really, in our opinion, a function of a poor economy. Boats are a discretionary need in most cases. There are obviously those that live on them, but you don't necessarily have to own a boat. Most of the people that do certainly clearly enjoy them and don't want to get rid of them, but they're expensive. So if the economy improves, we're anticipating that slip transfer fee will go up. It won't maybe necessarily go up as quickly as we'd like to see it, and that is why you're seeing the disparity of the fees going up but not the gross revenue.
A question, John, just because I'm unclear myself, and maybe it would help the rest of the commission. I know since it's a 2-year budget, there'll be an opportunity to tweak it mid-year. If we wanted, and I'm just asking the question, if we wanted to do something, say, in the for the second year to tweak it and say, well, the slip transfer fees seem to be recovering now, and what we would like to do is say exclude the 25s because we think for year 13 that maybe they've gone high enough. Would we have that option in the mid-year?
Yes.
Yes, Mr. Chair, we will have that option about this time, well, February, March timeframe next year, to do what is called a mid-cycle review, and then make recommendations to change where we need to.
Okay. And then one other point that I'm going to ask this because I'm pretty sure I know the answer, but it was something that I was opposed to. I don't remember the line item, but I think it's around $250,000 a year, which is the fireworks, which is the maintenance of the restroom, which is the beach lifeguards, which is a budget line item that we picked up 2 years ago, was it? 3 years ago? I forget how long ago it was. But we used to not carry those costs. And I am still of the opinion that those are benefits for the entire community and that the waterfront department paying those, even though the facilities are located there and everybody comes down and enjoys it here, that it's a citywide event and truly belongs back in the general fund and not in this budget. And that would take, I think it's $250,000 a year, roughly, give or take $20,000 out of our budget every year, and that's a big expense. And I'm wondering if there is a mechanism whereby we could, not in this budget cycle, but make a recommendation when things are not quite so exciting on the city level that they consider taking these back, since we carried that water for them for a few years. Just stay.
It wouldn't. There's nothing that would prevent you from making that recommendation.
Just like they want the expense back. Yeah, right. Okay.
We'll end up replacing them.
Yeah, well, that's why I tried to stop. You let the nose of the camel come under. He's in the tent with you shortly. Okay, so I think those are all the comments. Oh, one last question. Excuse me, Scott. I don't know why I didn't think of this sooner. When we have under parking services the pay and display, when you had discussed that, you gave a very good description of how onerous it is to deal with the squashed up money, the little folded bills, and how often everybody has to go around because a slot can only take so much money, and then even if you want to pay, I know I've had this happen, you can't get any money in the slot, so you have to go move your car to one where you can then get the money in the slot, so you're not in violation. It's very exciting. Will that create any economy of and staff savings when we put these pay and display things in, that we won't need as many people to gather up the money or straighten out the bills or count them up?
Mr. Chair, yes, there will be. I've done some preliminary cost-benefit analysis, and we can bring that back to you next month. But we anticipate the cost of monitoring the 5 honor fee lots is approximately $43,000 a year. So when this program is fully implemented, we expect an annual savings of about $43,000 a year out of the salaries line item. So and we expect additional savings and efficiency in the auditing, which is where they have to uncrinkle all the money. So
okay, excellent.
$40,000 to $50,000 ballpark when fully implemented. And we'll bring that back to you next month.
Thank you. Commissioner Sloan.
But we're still going to have to monitor those lots to make sure that people are paying in the machines, correct?
Correct, Commissioner Sloan. I've been speaking with my parking staff, and we believe we can have what we call our leads take over the monitoring tasks because it'll be much more efficient. They can virtually drive through the lots, not virtually, not,
Right.
To check that the tickets are there.
So there will be some savings, but not the entire monitoring amount.
The monitors are a class of their own, and the leads are a class of their own, and we'll probably have, once this is fully implemented, the leads doing the monitor function. So the monitoring as it stands today of $43,000 should go away completely.
Okay, thanks.
Commissioner Anakuchin.
Yes, a comment. I wanted to thank Scott for the graphics, and they help a lot, and I'd like to see a lot more of them. Thank you.
All right, are there any other comments or questions for Commissioner Spicer?
Real quick, with respect, Chairman, I overheard you speaking to Commissioner Sloan, and I just wanted to know the process of where you step down from an election and where you don't. If you could just explain it for me and anybody else who's interested.
My understanding, because I went back and forth with two different sets of attorneys, is the actual law is if in an annual year you're going to have a $250 benefit, then you have to recuse yourself because that's considered that's a conflict. Then the second consideration is if it is a appearance of impropriety, and that becomes a judgment call on the part of the individual. So what I have done in the past is I'll indicate that yes, I am a slip holder, but it doesn't come to the $250 year increase is what we're talking about. So I don't think there's an appearance of impropriety. I'm being very straightforward about why I would vote on that. Being a slip holder, the transfer fee doesn't necessarily have to be paid by the individual acquiring the slip. I mean, who knows what the transaction will be. So that would exceed the threshold. So on B, I would not be voting because that could easily be construed the wrong way.
I appreciate that.
Okay. I mean, that's my interpretation of it. And I've been back and forth with the city attorneys a couple of times on that. So let's see if we can get a motion on this that we can all somehow vote for while we're sitting here.
Just to help the process a little bit, what we do by separating out A, B, C, and D. A, obviously you received the presentation.
Right.
You don't need to make a motion on that. B and C needs to be made and adopted by
motion.
By a motion separate so that Commissioners Kelly and Sloan can recuse himself. If Commissioner Kelly doesn't want to do that relative to, I guess, C, that's his choice. So those two gentlemen, if you will, probably would not make that motion, and then they can determine how they would vote on it. And then on D, I would think the full commission is in a position to make a motion and a recommendation to the council.
So,
Each one is a separate.
yeah, let's do each one as a separate. A doesn't need to be done. B, Commissioner Sloan and I actually really can't do, so we'll have to recuse ourselves. Is there a, but I can still call it, is there a motion to accept the recommendation of B, which has to do with the $25 per linear foot slip fee increase in fiscal year 2012-2013?
So
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, there's a second. So, will you be... Okay, so Commissioner Sloan and I will recuse ourselves on that vote. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed? So B passed. Then we go to Section C, and again, you're going to recuse yourself on that, okay? So on Section C, which is the approval of a 3% slip fee increase in fiscal year 12 and a 2% slip fee increase in fiscal year 13. Is there a motion on that?
I so moved.
And is there a second? Okay, Commissioner Anakuchin seconded. Any further discussion on that? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay. So how many ayes were there? I was unclear on that. So let's just do a show of hands so we can see on C again, because I didn't hear because of the singing. All those in favor of C, would you so indicate by raising your hand? Okay. And opposed? Okay. And that passes. Now, D, which is to forward the recommendation of the entire budget with B and C included in it. Is there a motion for that?
Almost.
It's like nobody wants to make that motion. Okay. And is there a second? Okay, Commissioner Bantalan seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay. So, the budget passed. I thank everyone. It was a very interesting process. I'll use that word. And are there any commission staff communications, Mr. Bridley? Any commission staff communications, Mr. Bridley?
Yes, I'm sorry. At the beginning of the meeting, Commissioner Kramer asked some issues as it related to the tsunami, and as you know, the agenda was prepared before the event took place, so we didn't include anything in writing, and I'm not sure you could necessarily include anything in writing because it would have been a long story. What I would say overall is the harbor suffered very minor damage, if any. We had some water lines and some cleats that were broken within the marinas themselves from the surge that came in and out of the harbor. The bait barge, as you may have either read or saw, broke loose from its mooring and was damaged but salvaged in that we were able to more or less lasso it and keep it from bouncing further off of boats or the marina facilities in the afternoon. And it's currently being repaired by Sea Landing and the owner, and hopefully we'll be back in business shortly because without it, the sport fisher doesn't operate very well. So hopefully in a short time frame that will be repaired. Probably the most noticeable or discernible effect of the tsunami was significant tidal surges which occurred throughout the day on Friday in its most, shall I say, violent fashion, and then had continued probably for the next 48 to 72 hours afterwards, but with tidal fluctuations that were far less. On Friday, we experienced somewhere in the range of 5 feet, 4 to 5, maybe even 6 feet tidal fluctuations within a 10-minute period of time. So in other words, it would go up in 10 minutes, 5 or 6 feet or 4 or 5 feet, and it would drop almost as fast as it went up in the next 10 or 15 minutes also. In the intertidal area adjacent to the breakwater and the buildings, it was really only noticeable by docks and boats going up and down. But as you got closer to the navigational channel and the end of the rock groin, both at Sea Landing and the rock groin of the breakwater, the tidal surge was a running river, virtually. There was a gentleman that has a boat moored or berthed on Esfinger in Marina 1. He turned on his sonar and had readings of 20 knots of current going underneath his boat. And it's almost hard to fathom that in an inner harbor area. I mean, you can see 20 knots in a raging river and go, okay, that's kind of what they do, but you don't see tidal surges go in and out anywhere near that type of current ever. In our harbor. Those tidal surges were way after the predicted tidal wave, if you will, and I don't think there was ever any expectation that we would see some type of tidal wave. I think the prediction was a foot, foot and a half, maybe 2 in our region, and early in the morning when it was supposed to be 8:20, 8:40, 9 o'clock, you virtually didn't see that. And probably by 11 o'clock, 12, I think we declared the event over, only to make a huge mistake to think that it was. Because really, as the tide came in, the tidal surge became far more noticeable. We were at a fairly moderate tide throughout the day, but at 12 to 1 o'clock is when the bait barge broke loose, and when the crane barge, which there's a barge with a crane on it that supports the dredge operation, which was moored directly adjacent to West Beach, also broke off of its moorings. The cable line, steel cable that was on the mooring ball snapped, and basically it didn't really matter. The ground tackle and the anchors that were holding it there couldn't withstand the surge and current, and it was pinballing as fast as the tide went out. It was going towards Stearns Wharf, and when it came back in, it was going towards Marina 1 or Marina 4, and God only knows where it would have went if it just kept going. So we spent the afternoon with the dredge operator, Danny C. on the Miss Julie, and all of our Harbor Patrol boats and all of our staff trying to fend off a combination of a broke-up bait barge and a crane barge that could have caused significant damage. And that really happened or continued to happen until about 5, 6 o'clock in the evening, when it settled down to at least a reasonable amount, and we didn't feel that the ground tackle associated with the mooring balls were subject to sliding or dragging any further. We had tied off the crane barge to the dredge, which fortunately, with its spuds down, which are the large poles in the back of it, was well secured, didn't seem to move at all during the time frame. And it stayed there until probably Monday or Tuesday, when we felt everything was relatively safe enough to kind of go back to normal operations. Probably one of the most significant thing we debriefed about with staff is when we think, okay, there's going to be a tidal wave or tidal surge, it's going to come at a certain time, and then that's it. That's not. These events, based on what we saw in the Chile earthquake, which was just a few years ago or a year ago, and this one, that surge and that tidal fluctuation happens for 24 hours. And anyone or all of us should expect that's what we need to plan for. Not an event where someone takes their boat out of the harbor, stays out of the harbor past the time frame, and then brings it back in. If you really take your boat out of the harbor to do it right, you should prepare to probably stay out 24 hours. And then we could say it's all clear and comfortable, then you should bring it back in. It was interesting. I know Mick and I have talked about this, and I think there'll be further talk about it. The earthquake in Chile was far less in magnitude than the one that we had in Japan. That was a warning, a tsunami warning that we received for our harbor area. This event off of Japan was a tsunami advisory, which meant the expectation for Southern California from basically Point Conception to the Mexican border was an advisory zone or area. If you compare the two, it should have been a warning based on what we experienced in comparison to the Chile earthquake. Now, that's Monday morning quarterbacking, obviously, but I think there will be some modeling discussion about that. Obviously, our harbors north of us experienced far greater damage and impact because of the facing due south and because of their configurations. Obviously, Crescent City has always been a target for that. I'm not sure. I think it's a deeper water offshore that maybe draws the energy better into the coastal zone. So that would be what I'd have to report, and I'd certainly share it with Mick or Scott, who were also there kind of wondering, wow, what are we doing, and are we going to be okay?
Mr. Briley, since I was watching from the end of Marina 1 with some trepidation, because you were underway, literally, I mean, throwing up a very high wake. I noticed all the sand be depleted on the rock groin, coming the shoreward finger of the rock groin off the... Do we have any idea what this has done to the amount of dredging or non-dredging that needs to be done for the near future?
So in other words, where did it all go?
Correct.
Yeah. No, we don't really have a good sounding yet. I know the dredge operator, and we're looking at, beyond the navigational channel, because I'm not I'm less concerned about the navigational channel because whether it's there or it's not there, it'll get dredged as soon as the dredge can get back on station. Its electrical line was snapped. Its underwater dredge pipe that takes the sand onto the beach was wrapped around the dredge. I don't know how many times, about around the spuds, like it was a wet noodle. And I mean, that's a 16-inch hard gauge plastic pipe. I can't even visualize that. But so it'll be a while before that starts. What we're going to do is look to see where that sand got deposited, because at Marina 4, as you come around the corner, that's basically been cleaned off. The backside of the groin has been cleaned off adjacent to Marina 1. But we had some depths in the navigational channel. I think at one point we had 40 feet. So it did a little dredging, but where it deposited the sand, I'm not sure we know exactly yet.
Okay.
Just as an add-on to that, we resounded today just with our patrol boat, and that area is more in the 20s again. So yeah, it was probably all moving around still for 2-3 days. I'd just like to reiterate what Mr. Briley said about the wisdom of going to sea. We're learning a lot. I don't know how many times you can see two tsunamis like this in the period of a year, which will provide enough data sets for the modelers to really improve their work, I guess, is the good news. But if you do go offshore, be prepared to stay there for 24 to 48 hours, because some of the biggest problems boats get into and got into is trying, they go for 6 hours, they figure it's, game over, and they come back in, and they get caught in one of those rips, and you literally have no control. There was one vessel that came in on a flood surge, and he was zipping through the harbor. He came in hot, so to speak, and he flew down the channel at a high rate of speed, and you can lose complete control at the harbor mouth. So it's important to understand, you provision up and be ready to stay gone for a while if you're going to leave the harbor in one of these.
Commissioner Kramer.
Thanks for the report. I was really curious. And what time did you get the report of this possible tsunami? And how did you use the reverse 9/11, or how did it work? What did you do?
Well, Mick's the one that got the call in the middle of the night, so I'll let him report.
We got the report almost instantaneously when it came from the North Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Alaska, and that was shortly after the earthquake. The timing, that part of the system worked well. Harbor Patrol was alerted. The supervisor was alerted. I was alerted. Then we were all up watching TV and listening to the news at by 1:45 in the morning. What I was particularly concerned about, because I'm sort of the guy who, in consultation with John, makes the call for the reverse 911 or not, was watching, whether we were going to be in a warning zone or an advisory zone. And they're distinctly different as it goes warning, advisory, watch, information statement. And I generally, what I did last time, I tied my decision-making to whether or not it was a warning or not, because warnings, the text for a warning specifically speaks to staying out of harbors, staying away from harbors and what have you, whereas the text is a little softer on the watch. So it just made it more difficult when we found out the warning went to Point Conception. So it's at your back door, it's your call, is basically, the message I was getting from the electronic world. And we made the call to stick with no reverse 911. With hindsight bias in place, I probably would have issued the reverse 911, knowing how considerable the event turned out to be, unlike the last one where we did the reverse 911 and it wasn't that considerable. So we're learning as we go, but we don't want to overuse that system either. Very cautious not to create panic, not to draw hundreds, if not 1,000 or 2 people down to the harbor into a zone that could be dangerous. So balancing all those things is a little bit tricky, but we're learning as we go. Hopefully we won't have to do this again for quite a while.
All right. Any other comments? Commissioner Sloan.
Yeah, just along those same lines. So did we actually have you received reports from individual berthed boats that there was damage on that? And if so, or regardless of that, is there any way to issue recommendations or guidelines or something in one of the public forums, the dock lines or something like that, what to do in case of a surge tide like that?
Commissioner, I'm not aware of any boat damage other than some boats that were dinged and scuffed by various vessels ping-ponging around down the main federal channel, and the bait barge, I believe, scuffed up a boat in Marina 4. We are in the process right now as I speak, and I'll be finishing it up and editing it tomorrow, a debrief article in Docklines on tsunamis and making some of those kinds of recommendations that you suggest. It's a little bit different than a coastal storm insofar as, when a tsunami is predicted, you wouldn't want necessarily, hundreds of boaters coming down, tying up their lines. But that's just good practice, and that's probably the way I'll articulate it in the article. Generally, it's good practice. This is another reminder why it's good practice to make sure your boat is securely tied to the dock, that your spring lines are in the right and proper position and what have you. That's probably the way I'll phrase it, because I don't think there's anything particular you could tell folks to run down and do during a tsunami.
Commissioner Bantalon.
Just another question for Mick, and I appreciated you trading emails early Friday morning. But I guess just to go back to that, it's a tough call on the reverse 911, and I know you don't like to use the Blackboard Connect system for that. You don't like to overuse it. Is this a case where, when it's not, maybe a full reverse 911 situation, that we can at least let folks know?
Commissioner Bantalon, and I see we got Commissioner Anakuchin's attention because we talked about this last month, and actually, Commissioner Anakuchin, I was thinking about you at 2 o'clock in the morning when I was looking at all this. I go, boy, do I go Blackboard Connect? Do I go reverse 911? And I think the reason we wouldn't go Blackboard Connect is because it's emergency response related. Still, it gets away from the main purpose of the reverse 911, which is basically harbor projects, construction projects, boat relocations, and the kind. I mean, that was my thinking as I was going through it in the middle of the night. I didn't want to misuse either system, so I ended up using neither. Not sure that was, in retrospect, it's easy to say that was right or wrong, but that was my thinking.
Okay, and then
one further comment on that, and I know Mick's talked about this. In fact, we've talked about it as part of the debrief. We could have done the reverse 911 and said it was simply an advisory, and that it was not a warning, and that would have at least communicated what people may have not known as part of that. But again, advisory is really kind of you decide what you should do, not us telling you what you shouldn't do, which a warning would be don't go to the ocean, don't go to the harbor, don't go in low-lying areas. So that's the difficulty of Mick trying to make that judgment call about should I use it, shouldn't I? And we could certainly talk about that further.
Okay. And then second question was, I had heard some of the harbors down south in the L.A. area had actually closed and weren't allowing boats to go in and out. I happened to be with a slip holder that morning, and he thought that might be a liability issue if something, if damage did happen to your boat, you weren't allowed to go out. And I know you talked about, the dangers of going out into the oceans, but can you speak to that? I know you're not lawyers, but is there any thought of that?
Commissioner Bantalon, yes. In fact, during the event, we actually did close the harbor at various times, in part because of the emerging debris field that began to, when things began to pull apart, like the big barge and what have you, in the noon hour, and partially based on the timing of the surges. There would be slack, there would be surges and slack and surges, and partially based on, discretionary decisions based on the type of vessels. Could the Allen T, a twin screw, I think they probably got twin V12s or V16s in them with bow thrusters, make it push their way through? Yeah, to get their crew out to the rigs. But sail vessels in particular, with the mercy of these kinds of surges, we kept sailboat charters from leaving the harbor, and we escorted sailboats into the harbor. So it was a whole sort of variable mix. But yes, absolutely, we would consider harbor closure. I would put life safety issues ahead of litigious issues in those circumstances. I'd be more concerned about doing the right thing relative to people's lives.
And litigation issues really would be another question for an attorney. I don't know that I think, you have some immunity to make a judgment call at the time you make it. Whether that's the right one or the wrong one is certainly going to be another Monday morning type of thing. But we closed the harbor. We escorted people in. We didn't want anybody else going out, given, at that point, literally, we had a crane barge that was bouncing from one side. I mean, if Frank was there, he saw it. So you didn't want anybody transporting up and down the navigational channel. But when things began to become calm enough and we knew those folks needed to get back in the harbor, we certainly let them in. By Saturday, we did what was called a soft closure, which meant we weren't in a position to escort you. We weren't in a position really to advise you. We felt the event was slowing down. You make the choice, again, kind of as an advisory decision. There was still a 3-foot tidal fluctuation going on, which, as you know, usually takes 6 hours. It doesn't take 15 minutes. So there was continuing concern by even Saturday and into Sunday.
It was exciting. All right. Are there any other comments or questions? Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your expertise and your.
Sorry, I did have one before we adjourn. This wasn't on the same topic, but I was just wondering if we could get an update on the electrolysis. I know we don't have a final report. Is there anything to update before we do?
No, and I made a mental note. Well, actually, I made a written note. We will bring the electrolysis report to the commission. We have a draft of the report. It's not finalized yet. I expect within a week or two we will have that final report. So that's kind of the status of where we're at.
Thanks, and I will make the motion to adjourn. How's that?
Good. Is there a second? All those in favor? Aye.